All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to the March 14th meeting of the Brentwood Planning and Zoning Commission. If you'll please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please.
I'm sorry. Sherry Bilderberg.
Here.
Michael Daming.
Here.
Jim Hansen.
Here.
Michael Hott.
Here.
Jeff Moore.
Here.
John Ritter.
Here.
Tom Shipley.
Here.
John Nürnberger is here. We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nürnberger. Does everyone have these January 10th, 2018 meeting minutes in front of them? Okay. Are there any revisions, amendments to said minutes? Seeing none, they'll stand as approved by acclamation. We have one item under old business this evening, which is the short-term rental issue and the proposed text amendments. We have a couple different versions in front of us. The commission will recall this is the third time that the commission has taken up this issue. There's been spirited discussion, spirited debate at the first two sessions that we took up the issue. The chairman's recollection is that a majority of commissioners at the last meeting were in favor of an outright prohibition, with a consensus straw poll being taken immediately after the mayor spoke about security issues and the ability to enforce the short-term rental issue with the resources that are currently allocated to such a matter. Other people may have a different recollection. That certainly is my recollection, but we have it before us today. The commission has a ordinance prohibiting short-term rentals outright, and another ordinance that would purport to allow them with various regulations. Looks like kind of an a la carte list of regulations that, to the extent the commission did want to allow these short-term rentals but regulate them, they could pick and choose with this ordinance. So with all that being said, everyone, I think, or most of us here have spoken their piece, but let's open it up for comments, questions, analysis, and let's see where this takes us over the next few minutes. Ms. Bilderback.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I definitely am in favor of an outright prohibition, and at this time, I also don't think beyond that. I think that's good public policy for all the reasons I've said before. I think looking at the list of communities that have prohibited it, I think it's a good group to be in, and frankly, I think that our current ordinance, the way that it's written, already prohibits it. This just makes it, perfectly clear with like the newfangled language. I think that if at any time the state legislature would deem it in its wisdom to put any regulations or requirements along the lines of the two House bills that have been introduced on this, that at that point we would have enough time before the bill would become effective to do our due diligence as to any requirements in a new ordinance to go along with state statute. I did pull up House Bill 2457 on the website today and found that it had a House Committee substitute, which Lisa kindly, our Planning and Zoning Director, kindly copied for everyone. I have not sat it down side by side to the last version. I will note that bill right now, just to give you some idea of how slowly the legislative process works in the state, it doesn't have a Senate companion bill, and normally if you don't have a Senate companion bill, that makes it a little bit more challenging to get a piece of legislation through the legislature, and this is why. I've actually come up against this many, many times. I was a lobbyist for over 25 years, and what happens is the senators will not consider any amendments on the floor of the Senate unless it's had whatever the language is, has had a hearing in the Senate. So every time you go to them as a lobbyist, which would include, who I can imagine the proponents of this legislation are, anytime they would go to a senator and say, we want you to support this amendment on the Senate floor, they would say, well, has it had a Senate hearing? And the answer, if it's no, means it's pretty much dead on arrival. And right now where this bill is, the two bills, one of them hasn't moved at all. The other one that we have the House Committee substitute for, I think it was on March 6th, they had the House hearing on it. This was the committee version. So what happens is it was referred to the Rules Committee. So now the Rules Committee has to schedule a hearing, and it has to schedule an executive session. And then it has to be voted out of the Rules Committee at the executive session. So far, there's 2 Rules Committee hearings that are scheduled on the House calendar, however, neither of which lists this bill on that committee's hearing. So right now, we're at March 14th. The session ends like roughly around the second week of May on a Friday. So then it has to go from the Rules Committee, it has to be placed on the House calendar. So then there's time once it comes out of the Rules Committee before it's placed on the House calendar for action. And then once it's placed on the House calendar, it goes on the perfection calendar, and perfection means that they have a big discussion about it and they amend the legislation. So after it goes through that process, it then goes to the calendar on House bills for third reading. And then it has to, there's other bills and other floor schedule time competing with it, so all of this takes time. It can be really frustrating as a lobbyist or someone advocating for a piece of legislation because you're trying to get it to move and to go forward, and it just seems to drag. So by the time then it gets out of, let's say it passes the House on third reading, final passage, it goes over to the Senate. Then it has to get assigned, it has to be first read, second read by the Senate. Those happen on different days. Then it has to be referred to committee, and then the committee has to schedule a hearing. At this point in the session, they would start to have House bills that are already over in their Senate committee, so those would take priority because they're closer to passage. Maybe, but then they have their own Senate bills and all this kind of stuff. So then it has to have a hearing, and then it has to go through the whole process on the Senate side. So up until the point where it has a Senate hearing, it's not even really eligible in most senators' minds every time that me or my colleagues have ever talked to them to be amended onto the floor of the Senate. What all of this tells me, reading the tea leaves, is I seriously doubt this is going to pass this year. And there's other reasons why I think that relative to this year. So I think it's going to take some time. So in my mind, for all the reasons that I previously stated and what all of the residents who came and spoke with their very vociferous concerns at our last meeting said, I think the prohibition is the way to go. And unless until the state passes something, then we'll have time before the bill's effective to deal with that at the time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Hanson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm appreciative that we've had discussion on this topic. I think we've done our due diligence now. When the language first came to us, I think without taking a closer look at it, we wouldn't have done a service to our community. I would be in favor of regulating rather than prohibition for reasons I've said before. I'll be brief. I won't belabor the point. But this to me seems like Uber 2.0. I think we want to be on the right side of history here. Brentwood is uniquely situated in the central corridor. We're not Ladue. We're not Frontenac. We live in a diverse community, in a vibrant community that wants homeowners, renters, and investors to come into the community. We have homes that are bungalows, that are 2-bedroom, 1-bath homes that would have essentially 3 different property values. A tear-down value, so we can keep putting these behemoth new constructions up. A value for a homeowner, or a value for an investor, whether that was a short-term rental or a long-term rental. I think that the regulations put into place by Maplewood, by Ellisville, would straddle the line between preserving what our community wants, which is a nice neighborhood where people feel safe and where people feel welcome, but also keeping a foot on the, I guess, what I would call the more progressive side of what may come in the future. Whether or not, and I appreciate the legislative lesson, whether or not that bill makes it out of Rules Committee or is passed this time or in the future. I mean, we have Airbnb already making deals with the state about the taxability of the matter. So I think it's just a matter of when and not if. And so I would be in favor. I would ask the other commissioners to strongly consider looking at this with an eye towards regulating rather than outright prohibition. I think the regulations are very are very strict and very strong, and I think that's probably necessary since we are, according to the language given to us, 52% of political subdivisions haven't adopted regulations. We're right there in the middle of trying to do that on the front end / middle, and I would hope that we would carefully proceed, but choose to proceed rather than prohibit. Thank you.
Mr. Shipley?
I would agree 100% without repeating all of it, what Ms. Henson just said. I would be not in favor of a prohibition. I would be in favor of implementing some regulation. I think, having guests visit Brentwood is a positive impact on the economy, where they would spend money in restaurants and grocery stores, et cetera. I think it's very popular, it's become very popular very fast because people like it, and it's overall, it's a good thing. And in my experience, I've used it, I've been on the websites, I've traveled, I've stayed in these. I don't have an extra room in my house, so I have not been a renter of a participant in that. But these platforms are really self-regulating, where people have to give up a lot of information. There's ratings on both the properties and the guests. So if something goes wrong, people end up with a lower rating. They make it difficult to get to continue to participate in the platform. So that's where I continue to stand.
Okay. Anyone else on the commission? We'll open up to the audience. Anybody in the audience that would like to address the commission on this issue? Yes. Please step forward, ma'am, to the mic because we are on video. Could you please state your name and your address and state your point.
I didn't know I was going to be on America's Most Famous. My name is Edie Covington, and I live down the street on Harrison. And I share the yard with a person who doesn't live there, who I don't know even when they bought the building, and they have Airbnb there. And so if the leaning is towards not prohibition, but it's toward regulation, because as I understand it now, it's not, we shouldn't have Airbnb, and we have it right next to me and 2 doors down. So when you say you're in favor of regulation, how does that look?
Well, you say, so ma'am, the fact is that Airbnbs right now are illegal in the city of Brentwood. So
They're legal?
Illegal.
Right, so if we're having it now and it's illegal, I'm interested to understand how does regulation look, since we have someone that's there that no one in my neighborhood even knows. The person that was living there is gone, and I guess he must have sold it to, my research showed he sold it to a real estate company, and a real estate company is usually, I call it the Harrison Hotel, because no one lives there. It's just an Airbnb.
And have you notified the code enforcement division of the
Yes.
city?
Miss Karen asked a couple
Yeah,
times,
it's,
so.
it's very important because they are not, that is not legal, that is not proper in the city of Brentwood. There's many different, that's one of the ordinances that we have, there's many different regulations, types of regulations. We could impose one or all of them.
So right now, something surreptitious going on, and nobody knows about it. There's a lot of activity there. And I've used Airbnb like he has, but one place I was, it was heavily regulated, not only by people that had the home, but the jurisdiction. Park on this side, do this. So I'm just interested, if we're not favoring the prohibition, then I would be interested in understanding how are you going to allow people to come into our area?
Okay, well, thank you, ma'am. Let me go ahead and thank you very much. Ms. Kirkemeyer actually and staff had spent a significant amount of time compiling various regulations that the commission could consider were it to regulate these short-term rentals. Ms. Kirkemeyer, can you just briefly summarize what you found?
Sure, and to the last point that was made, I'm sure I've stated this at a P&Z meeting before. I know it was discussed at the Public Works Committee, which is where this whole idea of clarifying a prohibition came from. Probably since, at some point last year, maybe late summer, early fall. We have 4 or 5 that we have continually documented. So it's not that they haven't been reported or that we're not aware of them, but when we asked the city attorney about enforcement of it, with kind of the lack of clarity in our current code, it was really recommended by the city attorney that we address that issue before we pursue full enforcement. So that's kind of where we're at with it. So I just wanted to explain that. But then, I guess to move on from that point then, so again, what we were hearing from the January 10th and from the January 31st meetings was that there was definitely a straw poll vote taken, and there were others that would be like, well, I would maybe look at it this way if this was applied. So that's why we brought something back to consider. That came about from what we think would be, if there would be any regulations, what would be in the best interest of Brentwood. So it's not a copycat necessarily of other ordinances out there, but that was the other thing that staff was charged with, that's recorded in the minutes, that we were to look at what other ordinances were allowing. So we did a pretty extensive research, maybe not exhausted, but we definitely looked into others. We still had only found 2 ordinances in the St. Louis metropolitan area that are on the books that actually regulate them. I'm not going to say that they are the only ones out there, but the ones that we found. So that was Maplewood and Ellisville. And again, we didn't try to pick and choose to make it come out this way, but we found 5 communities that responded to our survey that have an outright prohibition. And again, possibly they've had it before, but they've taken steps within the last, say again, year and a half or so studying the issue, and they strengthened their ordinances. Those communities include Ladue, Chesterfield, Richmond Heights, Frontenac, and Hazelwood. And just as many in the category really fall, though, kind of where we're at is where not regulating, because again, the codes aren't crystal clear, and so those fall, communities fall in that category are like De Pere, Kirkwood, Creve Coeur, and Baldwin. So as you can see, we didn't really have a lot of adopted ordinances to even go by. So what we did then was we picked out a few of the statements that were made at last meetings concerning Mr. Neuenberger's point about a difference if someone actually, if the owner is on site or if they have a property manager that could be called. We didn't really hear anybody being a proponent of a spatial distance between of the short-term rentals, but it was brought up in part of the discussions. I think that's an option in it. So that's and there was a few other things that we picked. If the commission decides they want to pursue this more, we can get into it. We're not thinking that the ordinance was crafted maybe exactly how it needed to be. But quite frankly, we have to, figure out if this is something even really that the community is going to embrace before we maybe perfect an ordinance. And then also, I guess, just for clarity, realize too that there's kind of a difference between just adopting the ordinance and making the activity legal versus also then this whole realm of how do you kind of put the regulations and the program together. So we really haven't even surfed all of that, if you will, either until we really decided which direction this was going to go. So again, I can go into more details or just kind of be available for questions as you further discuss this. So,
Mr. Nurnberger?
So would that, having the ordinance, make it easier for enforcement? Is that what you're saying?
well, yeah, the prohibition, the one that was presented back in January, which again kind of, we came out of Public Works Committee, would help be able to enforce it. Because even though they've been around for a while, it's been a while since our code has also been really overhauled as well. So we don't quite have some of the language defining it really well. So, one of the first things was even calling it what it is and coming up with definitions for short-term rentals. So definitely was to help.
So you think that would
clear it
help
up.
the situation for the current residents that are experiencing the Airbnb right now? If we enacted this ordinance, it would help to some degree to be able to control people having them.
It certainly would. We would have, very specific sections of the code to cite.
And I understand might have to go through a couple of remunerations or whatever. This might not be the total bill as it stands, but you're thinking that would be good. Yeah.
Well, either way, how this discussion goes would be good to get
Right.
better than what we have right now. So,
Thank you.
Certainly
Sure.
there'd be clarification.
Yes.
To me, there's there's no occupancy permit to allow this, so I don't, it seems
Right.
pretty clear to me, but more clarification, I'm sure would help. Ms. Bilderbeck?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that our planning director made a good point as far as, I mean, even though I read this as currently prohibiting it, our current ordinance, that the clarification would, using the current day lingo, you know, we don't use the lingo of tourist homes now, we use the lingo of, you know, accommodations for transient guests. So I think that it would make it clear what already was the intent that was in our code. And definitely that would help with code enforcement to resolve the problems that the current residents are having, that had raised all of the breadth of concerns at our last meeting. And I don't think it makes any sense to go into trying to go through all the effort to craft some regulations on a thing that may eventually be addressed by the state legislature, when we've got other communities, Ladue, Chesterfield, Richmond Heights, Frontenac, Hazelwood. Our current code doesn't allow it, and this would just clarify it and give the code enforcement some teeth. So to me, I think that the prohibition is the way to go right now.
Can I a point of clarification with Mrs. Corkemeyer? You said that a prohibition would help enforce, but it's also true, right, that if the ordinance went through with regulations, there'd be an enforcement mechanism in there, and that too, correct?
Just to have better regulations all the way around, whichever direction, prohibition, regulation would help.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you weren't saying if we did a prohibition, it'd be favorable to our residents because there'd be an enforcement mechanism, but not if an ordinance were regulated. You in fact are saying that either way, we're in good shape because it would give some level of enforcement to the community and probably equal enforcement, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, Kathy Thomas, and I live on Madge Avenue, Ward 3. I want to thank you all for taking such careful consideration of all of this, and I'm in favor of regulation because it does seem to make it easier to enforce the codes. I've done a little bit of research on the topic, and for the favor of Brentwood, the research shows that 52% of daytime dollars spent by these people is spent in our community. So there's a definite benefit there, besides having the authority to enforce guests. There's also, I know that there are a lot of complaints about some of the Airbnbs that are going on now. A large percentage, like in the 90s, come from non-owner occupied rentals. So that could be an ordinance that you consider that only owner-occupied rentals would be allowed. It holds the owners accountable. Now, I have also found that there are outside vendors that will come in to manage your regulations, and fairly reasonable. I found one that was charging only $400 a year, and then a per fee for each of the rental homes in the district. So if enforcing requires a permit, the permit requires money, so that helps pay for the vendor that's going to manage the regulations. It holds the owners accountable. I would even be in favor of submitting a penalty if you have a substantiated complaint. And I would almost propose that two people would have to collaborate or have it on video. Like if it was a noise ordinance or nuisance of some sort, impose a penalty on that owner after maybe the first complaint, let them address it. If by the third complaint it has not been addressed, you remove their permit and impose a very high fine if they are found operating. So these are things that will help the city. Beyond the spending in grocery stores, retail shops, all of our businesses, it elevates our profile, as you had said, Ms. Hanson, and puts us on the right side of history. The environmental impacts alone, for a person to stay in a home over a hotel, 63% less energy used. So if anyone on the panel is green. It's also 33% less waste generated and 12% less water per person than if they were staying in a hotel. Property values do go up. The Missouri Realtor Association has shown that very clearly. So it's a win-win to regulate for all of us. And there is the safety factor because the guests are vetted. That transient term, these are not transient people, it's you and me, it's families. And I encourage that to elevate the community and introduce other people to our businesses and our home.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Anyone else like the audience like to address the commission on this matter? Come on up, Ms. Smith.
Karen Smith, I live at the Harrison Motel. In both ordinances, I appreciated the language that was inserted that, describes the purpose of residential zoning. I felt it was spot on. You want areas of the city, where you want certain activities to occur, you zone them for that. And we want to have areas of our city where we have a residential character. And I agree with the language that's in there that these short-term rentals do threaten this. My preference obviously would be the prohibition. As a house that lives across the street from one of these, it doesn't build my community. I don't even know who the people are that are in and out of there. As far as the argument, and I'd be very interested, I am always wanting to learn more. I'd be very interested in your sources because I know you gave us a lot of statistics, but I would really like to know the sources for some of that. Homeowners also spend money in our community, and we also support our schools. We uphold our ordinances. It's difficult to regulate these. For example, though, for 2 weeks, or no, I'm sorry, it was more like 3 weeks, there was one family that I think probably was not following our occupancy, parked illegally on our street. And I watched numerous police cars go up and down our street. Not once was that person ticketed. So we don't really regulate that, and I think if we're going to put this kind of burden on our city, we need to make sure that we financially, since we're going to be helping people run their business, I think we need to be able to make sure that financially the city is compensated for that. So we need to build that into the whatever fees that are charged for operating an Airbnb so that the city staff and the safety and security police and fire are all compensated appropriately, and it covers the additional costs. If we do allow these and we regulate them, I know in the ordinance that was put forward, or the bill that was put forward, there were two options. One was for having the homeowner be present, which I would definitely concur with that. The second option was to have a management company available 24 hours. If a homeowner is willing to subject neighbors in the Brentwood community to this type of a population, and I know you all feel comfortable that the technology appropriately screens these individuals. There are cases, though, that have been documented where that does not always provide a full safe mechanism. Then at the very least, that homeowner needs to be able to demonstrate this by being present in the home and in our community. Hotels have 24-hour security and staff to address issues that come up with people that are passing through the community. We need to be able to provide that same sort of assurance to our residents. And I won't go through. I mean, I reviewed the bill as well as the suggestions that, or the regulations that you had identified in the Maplewood. I didn't see a cap on the number, a conditional use permit, and so I think there are some other things we could do to tighten up the regulations, but until we get further direction on which direction we're going, I won't spend time going through those. I do value my home. I value my the other homeowners that are in my community. I appreciate living in a residential community. I don't appreciate living in a motel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Ms. Kirkemeyer, this Airbnb and short-term rentals is a newer concept for this region, at least. So to the extent the commission and the board decided they wanted to maintain the status quo and clearly prohibit the short-term rentals at this time, would there be anything after 6 to 12 months and perhaps Airbnb is more established as a safer and a lucrative concept, would there be anything that would prohibit us from then revisiting the concept and considering allowing it with regulations?
No, I don't believe so. Any elected official or body could initiate a text amendment at a later date.
Ms. Hanson?
I think that that's just kicking the can down the road. My opinion on that would be we've already devoted so much time to this. I think we make a choice. If we delay it for 6 months or 12 months or 18 months or until the legislature gets there, we have to make a decision at some point. I would rather do it after we've taken all this time and all this energy, listened to the public, had our attorney go through this, taken up the staff's time coming up with two really well-written choices. And my preference would be that we figure this out. We either go forward on an ordinance that regulates, or if unfortunately it votes the other way, then at least we know where we stand.
Yeah, I agree with that. If I wasn't clear, that's
Okay.
yeah. Ms. Bilderbeck?
Mr. Chairman, because this is going to be before the state legislature, because of the interest of the local community and the much larger crowd of residents that we had at our last meeting, for all the variety and host of concerns, and if you want to hear some of mine, they were on camera, I think, at the January meeting. I would like to move to recommend to the Board of Aldermen approval of the clarification of our prohibition against short-term rentals.
Is there a second? I'll second it. Any further discussion? There's a motion that's on the table to recommend to the Board of Aldermen that we prohibit short-term rentals at this time in the city of Brentwood. Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Sarah Bilderback,
Yes.
Jennifer Hansen,
No.
Michael Hart,
No.
John Nurnberger is no. John Ritter,
Yes.
John Schifferly,
No.
motion fails, Mr. Chairman. Did I miss something?
Good, Jeff.
What's that?
Miss me, John.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you're never here. Let's see, Jeff Moore.
Yes.
Motion fails, Mr. Chairman.
Well, isn't it a tie, Mr.
No,
Nurnberger?
it's 4-3.
4-3.
4-3, no?
Yeah, and then Mr. Chairman, I guess.
So,
Okay, motion fails.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure. So, Chairman, was your vote?
I don't think
We
they
get that
called
right?
me.
Oh, no. It's not a tie, so unless,
4-2.
yeah.
Okay, fails.
Okay.
So further discussion. Ms. Hanson, do you have a motion?
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion to go ahead and move forward with the ordinance that would allow short-term rentals and regulate them with, and somebody can help me with better language, but with the caveat that we now delve into the second part of that, which is what exact regulations we should and shouldn't have. Is that a proper motion, Mr. Chairman?
Well, do you have the regulations that you would like to be part of the ordinance?
I don't. Tom, do you? Would you rather make a motion if you've got something more specific?
Well, this document it's kind of laid out. It appears to have several sort of fill in the blanks, which would be, I guess, further discussion on each of those individually.
Yeah, I guess my preference would be to approve it as it exists, and then have a, bifurcate it, and then have a second discussion on, number 2 under permitted uses, so how many calendar days in a year. We've devoted so much thoughtful consideration to getting to this point. I don't want to just, do a fill in the blank that does a disservice to the people who have legitimate concerns about, living in the Harrison Motel or whatever it was called, or,
On both
and concerns on this side for progress too. So I don't think it would hurt us at this point to delegate additional time to make sure that we are equally thoughtful about the types of regulations. So I don't know if that just turn this into a discussion rather than a motion. If
Well,
so, that's fine.
We may need to just punt this to subcommittee in light of this, in light of regulation being the desired approach, unless, there's a lot of regulation, especially towards the end of the regulatory ordinance. There are many different options. So I'd suggest that we punt this to subcommittee, and then the pro-regulation participants come up with their preferred regulations, and we take this up at subcommittee.
Well, I think we've already passed a vote, Mr. Chairman, that failed with respect to prohibition versus regulation. So I don't want to be put on the spot in terms of making up regulations, but I think the will of the Planning and Zoning Commission at this point is to move forward to regulate. So I do not want to take it into subcommittee and somehow spend the entirety of subcommittee saying, no, it's a prohibition, no, it should be regulated. I think that the motion to prohibit has failed. I think that it's a 4-3 with an eye towards regulation. If somebody wants me to, say, let's pass this as is with the blanks, I can do that. But I think it could be a disservice to the commission to go into site committee and then go back 3 months' time as to whether it's a prohibition or it's a regulation.
I guess I don't understand. I
Yeah.
agree that the prohibition option failed, but to the extent we now want to regulate it, we need to have some movement there. So if there are regulations that are preferred and regulations that aren't preferred, we need to hear from that.
Understood. I just want an assurance that we don't get to site committee and suddenly we're backtracking. Well, we now want to bring this back up. We want to bring the motion back up to see if we can prohibit versus regulate. Am I not being clear?
No, I don't think so, because we act with the board that we have, and tonight we have just over a quorum. So to the extent that there was a motion to approve the regulatory ordinance with specific regulations identified, we can do that. Or we can take this up at a later date and take up the regulations that the commission would like to take up. I mean, we have to move it forward. I agree that the prohibition option failed this evening. So to the extent we want to pass this tonight with the regulatory ordinance, then we need to decide what regulations we want to pass. If we don't, if we want to take some time and decide what regulations we want to include, then it needs to be tabled.
Process.
Mr. Shipley.
Just a question on the process. So, could we make a motion to bring this, to gather at the subcommittee meeting to determine what the regulations would be, and then that would generate a new document that we could then vote on at the next planning and zoning meeting?
Yeah, I think that would, motion to table, and with the directive to staff to identify
Specific regulations?
specific regulations.
Specific permit, the cost of the permit, the number of days. We'd fill in all these blanks at the subcommittee meeting and then have a new document which we could
I think
vote
that's fine.
on.
We can have staff present us with a regulatory
No, that makes
ordinance that has regulations included, and to the extent we wanted to make adjustments to that, we could at subcommittee.
Great.
You want to make that motion?
Do I have to say all that again?
Say, what I said is fine.
I make a motion to move to subcommittee with the intention of defining the regulations, and the deliverable will be a new bill that this commission can take up at our next formal meeting in April.
Is there a second?
Second.
Does that make sense, Ms. Kirkemeyer?
You're gonna love me for this one. So, the motion's on the floor,
So
right?
the directives to staff, as the motion is currently stated, would be that the consensus of this commission here tonight is that we allow short-term rentals as regulated.
Right.
So the directive would be to present the commission with this regulatory ordinance with specific regulations identified.
So all that's clear for me, and I am saying this because I am a neutral party here, and I'm an employee, director, but I want to make sure then, just even though that there was an unfavorable vote on the prohibition of that bill, it still came from the Public Works Committee. So I might have to still seek clarification from the land use attorney if that ordinance still also gets forwarded to the Public Works Committee. Do you see what I'm saying? Because just because something gets turned down here by the Planning and Zoning Commission, it still has moved forwarded. So Unless we know a definitive answer on that, I may have to just get a clarification from the city attorney.
Yeah, not anymore. No, I think the consensus of this commission is that we want to allow short-term rentals with them being regulated. So we'd like to take up this regulatory ordinance.
And that's fine, so, but okay.
Any further discussion?
I guess I would just want Ms. Corkemeyer to continue, because I don't think we're on the same page. Is there something that we haven't resolved?
So in other words, I would like to get, I think, a legal opinion about this, that what could happen is maybe both go forward to the Board of Aldermen. It's just that one would have a unfavorable recommendation, and the other one may have a favorable recommendation.
Well, that could be, but I think given that there was two ordinances presented to the commission, I think it would make sense to hold off on any I do not believe that a denial of the prohibition ordinance requires referral to the Board of Aldermen. So I think the consensus of the commission is to wait on any recommendation until we have this subcommittee meeting taking up the regulatory ordinance.
Can the Public Works Committee refer something to the Board of Aldermen directly, procedurally? Can they do that?
Like I said, I would like to get just clarification on that.
Oh,
I
you
have
don't
not
know
run
that.
into this,
Okay,
no.
that's,
And
I think,
I'm
what
afraid,
everyone was
that maybe I would
pondering
be-
here. Like,
Yeah.
that's what I was getting. Can they do that directly? And that's the issue. Okay. And
So I
then,
don't-
you know, an alderman can always bring this up. Him or herself can, introduce something like this.
Except for
Can't
the
they?
fact, the way we were going to do either the regulations or the prohibition was through Chapter 400, which is our zoning code. And so the way our zoning code is currently written, the Planning and Zoning Commission has a role in that process to review it and to make a recommendation to the Board of Aldermen, whether it's to approve it or deny it or approve it with some conditions, so.
Okay. Well, certainly the referral of the regulations has not been made yet, and the commission has a motion on the table to take up that regulatory.
And that part's crystal clear, so at the March meeting, we can even take this one and, refine the one that you saw tonight, and that will be the starting point or the foundation for this, so.
Very good. All right, there's been a motion and a second. Further discussion, Mr. Moore, do you have discussion?
I do. I just want to vocalize kind of where I'm coming from in prohibiting the short-term rentals at this stage. And really what it is the comment about the majority of our housing stock being two-bedroom units and how they're ideal for that short-term rental, but at the same time, the regulatory calling for an owner-occupied unit. I voted the way I did because I do think that regulating it with an owner-occupied restriction will have the same effect of squelching the market. So I came here thinking one direction, and now have voted another way. And the reason is because I'm looking at our housing stock and thinking, wait a minute, we aren't a community full of duplex or two-family units. I mean, these single-family homes are not going to work with an owner-occupied Airbnb, at least the smaller bungalows. So I just wanted to get that on the record that I'm open to the regulatory side, but I think that you will see that the majority of the units that are proposed for this are going to end up being ineligible because of the owner-occupied restriction.
Okay. There's a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? So again, the motion is to table this matter, and this matter encompasses both these options to the subcommittee to take up the regulatory ordinance as perfected by staff. Correct? Okay.
Yes.
Further discussion? Roll call?
Sarah Bilderback?
With the caveat, I'm supportive of tabling it, but I'm not saying I'm voting for anything. I'm going to be there to hash out the regulations. Yes.
Jennifer Hansen?
Yes.
Michael Hart?
Yes.
Jeff Moore?
Yes.
John Yumber is yes. John Ritter,
Yes.
Tom Schiffley.
Yes.
Yes. Motion passes, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
very good. We'll look forward to taking this up at the subcommittee meeting. No new business this evening. Alderman, Mr. Alderman Lockmuller, do you have any report? Okay. City planners report, Ms. Kirkemeyer?
I just wanted to give you a brief update about the comp plan and the schedule. This is not on the agenda tonight to discuss the comp plan, but I did want to let you know, and then especially with Commissioner Bilderback's help, last revisions were made to Chapter 6 residential area plan and were sent to the consultant. The Chapter 5 sub-area plans, a few new, or not new, but a few text revisions there was also given over to the consultant. We then had to go back, and Chapter 10 is the implementation strategies of it. So because the Chapters 5 and 6 were still being crafted, we had to go back and kind of make some changes to Chapter 10. And then I had also heard from the previous meetings that they wanted to see more exhibits of different projects that are on the drawing board for the community, so those will be inserted. And then just basically the maps that we have talked about previously. So with that being said, they committed to a delivery on or before April 2nd. So I guess that's where we're kind of at now in terms of, we knew this might be a lightly attended meeting because of it being spring break. And, but the next meeting, regular meeting then for planning and zoning would be April 11th. So I'm looking for your direction if you want to set that up as just the night you're going to take action on it. If you want to have a public hearing or an open house, maybe something similar to we had back in December. If we're going to do something more formal with a public hearing, I would definitely have to get that notice published by March 27th. So I am looking for direction tonight with how you want to set up that meeting in April.
It seems like we've had several public hearings on this, so is there any objection to taking this thing up once and for all, April 11th? Okay, there you go.
So as soon as I get it, it will be distributed to you all. We will also post it on the city's website, so it'll be available to everyone. We'll make sure the residents know that it's available, and we'll have several copies here at City Hall as well that they can come and look at or review the document. So thank you.
Okay, good. Subcommittee, we'll take up the short-term rental issue, March 28th, 6 o'clock. Is that okay, or do you want to do it later?
If we could split the difference at 6:30, that'd be fantastic.
All right,
I know I always
6:30?
push for 7 like we used
Somebody
to.
remind me, because I can't keep track and they change all the time.
March 28th, 6:30? Good for everybody?
Thank you.
All right, see everybody then. Rationale, we have none. Any other business? Chair will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, stand adjourned.